If you think reading classics is boring like I used to, here is a list of 10 thrilling page turners that are as easy to read as any modern book, but they are all classics. I think all of these books are a perfect introduction to classics, but the last one on the list to me is the absolute best. This is the one book that single-handedly made me go from thinking I hated classics to absolutely loving them. So the first 3 books on this list are probably the easiest classics you'll ever read, and number 1 is more of a series than one specific book, but it is The Chronicles of Narnia. I know these are technically kids' books, but I read them as an adult and I absolutely loved every single one of them. They are so fun and adventurous. It's like the perfect combination of the amazingness of C.S. Lewis's writing mixed with like a fun, younger fantasy story. I think my favorite of all these books was Prince Caspian, which I read second. They're the kind of books that are just automatically gonna put you in a good mood while you're reading them. They do have that beautiful older writing style that a lot of classics have, but like I said, the story is so young and fun that it doesn't make it boring or slow. So if you haven't read these yet, you have to read these books. They're so fun. I think I even want to reread them sometime soon. But now it's time for book number 2. Book number 2 is probably the most modern feeling classic that I have on this list. It is Fahrenheit 451. This honestly felt like it was a modern day book. It is a dystopian book about a guy living in a very controlling society where they completely ban all books. The government really wants to have a lot of control over the people. They don't want anyone learning things. They don't want anyone to have any knowledge, so all books are off limits. So pretty much everyone in this world is kind of like a walking zombie. Nobody really feels anything, nobody has any of their own thoughts, but that's also just what's normal to them. Anyway, the main character is a firefighter, but his main job is to go around and burn books. But after a little while, he starts to realize that maybe what he's doing isn't actually right. And then he slowly starts to develop a fascination with books, which makes him start to question everything about their government. And then there's kind of a whole unraveling from there. The writing style in this is very different from any of the other classics that I've read as well. I almost want to say it's like poetic. There's a lot of very short, choppy sentences. Just a very cool story all around. So if you're especially worried about reading classics because you think they're all very boring, this is definitely one you should start with because it is a very thrilling book. So the next book, which is the last in my first little section of very easy classics, is very similar to the last book. It is The Giver. So just like Fahrenheit 451, this book takes place in a futuristic society, only this time the main character is a kid. And very similar to the last book, the government is very controlling. Nobody's really allowed to have their own unique thoughts or opinions. The back says that the community is a precisely choreographed world without conflict, inequality, divorce, unemployment, injustice, or choice. But the main character is a little bit different from everyone else, and he, at only 12 years old, gets assigned to go work with this mysterious old man called the Giver, who slowly starts to teach him what it's like to actually have feelings and have choice, which again starts to slowly unravel this society. This book is actually a part of a series, but I've only read the first one, and again it feels very much like a modern book. So if you're nervous to try out classics, I would definitely suggest one of these first 3 books. Now it's time to get into the next little section of this list. The next 3 books are some of my favorite classics on this list, although not as great as the last one, of course. They are perhaps slightly more challenging, but something really great about these books is that they're so short. So even if they're hard, you can fly through them, but I do really think that you're gonna love them. And the first book in this section is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This is definitely one of my favorite classics. It's funny because I went into this book not having too high of expectations. I had no idea what was in store when I read this book. I think the characters are the most prominent in the story. They are so well written and so unique at the same time. It's interesting because there's very little backstory. It's like you don't get a ton of like information about the characters, and yet immediately you're so invested in who they are and their story, which is like so hard, I think, to accomplish in a book, and yet John Steinbeck does it so well. This book takes place during the Great Depression. It's about 2 friends who are trying to find work to make money to eventually accomplish their dream of buying a house on land and being able to work for themselves. However, that dream proves to be a little bit more difficult to accomplish than they thought, especially because one of the friends has a hard time, let's say, fitting in socially, and so he makes life kind of hard for the other friend as well. And if that plot doesn't seem super interesting to you, just know it is amazing. The ending of this book is insane. It's one of those stories where you finish it and you just have to sit there pondering life for a good 20 minutes before you get up. It's like one of those stories that everyone should experience at some point in their lives. So if you haven't read this book yet, like for high school or something, or maybe you did read it a long time ago but you don't really remember it, definitely try it out because it's so good. Throughout this list, you're going to start to notice that one of my favorite classic authors is John Steinbeck, and I already have a second John Steinbeck book. It's called The Pearl. This one I would especially recommend if you want to start out with really short books because this one is tiny. It is only, I think, like 90 pages long. This is a story about a man who makes his living from diving down into the ocean and finding pearls and then selling them to people, and he's very poor because of this. But one day he happens across a super ginormous pearl that's worth a ton of money, which seems amazing, but this is a very interesting story about what the obsession of money and power can do to someone. And in this book, it kind of drives the main character a little bit crazy. Instead of this pearl rescuing him from his poor life, it kind of ends up destroying it instead. So this is a very cool story. There's so much packed into these very few pages. I feel like this story is especially cool because it's one that you can learn so much from as well. So especially if you know you enjoy John Steinbeck, I would definitely recommend this one. The next book is for those of you who love a good mystery thriller like me. It's called And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This one is a little bit longer than the last two, but still decently short. It's only like 250 pages-ish. This is such a cool story about a bunch of strangers who are all lured onto this private island into this big mansion, and they each go to dinner at this mansion, and at the dinner there's this recorded message that tells each of them they're all carrying some secret, and then by the end of that night one of them dies. Because of that there's panic and chaos, but because of this big storm they're all stranded on this island, and then another one dies, and then another one, and another one, and everyone else who's still left alive is desperate to figure out who's killing them and why, so they can hopefully stop it. This is one of those book concepts to me that's just so appealing, so interesting. I remember when I first ever read the synopsis of this book, I immediately wanted to read it because I had to know what happened and how it ended. Agatha Christie has a lot of well-known mystery thrillers, but this is probably her most famous one, or at least one of her most famous, and I can see why because it's such a cool book. So if you're specifically looking for a thrilling classic, like one that's just a constant page turner, I would definitely suggest this one. Okay, the last book in this little section is another short one. It's only like 200 pages long. It is Frankenstein. I will say that this classic is probably the one that shocked me the most. I feel like we all grow up hearing about the story of Frankenstein, and I thought I really knew what this book was going to be about when going into it, but I was so surprised at what the story ended up being. It ended up being so much more like emotional and dark than I expected. I didn't expect it to be like a drama, but it definitely was. As you all probably know, this story is about a man named Frankenstein who creates this creature, and then soon after creating this zombie creature, whatever he is, he regrets it and abandons him. And then what follows is this really cool story of this creature who was created and abandoned, and him understanding life and his strange emotions and dealing with the fact that he's different from everyone else and he was abandoned, and slowly developing kind of like a hatred for his life and for the one who created him, and like morphing into the monster that he was always kind of thought to be. And so the whole kind of premise of the book is Frankenstein chasing after his owner, trying to kill him, trying to destroy his life. Yeah, just very intense, very suspenseful the whole way through. You get a lot of different perspectives in this book, and it's just really cool. I remember finishing this book and being like, wow, that was like just so different from what I expected. So a really cool story. I will say maybe so far of all the classics that I've talked about, this one might be the most challenging. I feel like you just have to put a little bit more mental energy into keeping up with what's going on, but it's definitely worth it because it's such a cool book. Okay, now it's time for my last little section, my little category of classics. This section is technically more difficult than any of the others I've talked about so far, but that being said, this is still a list of all very easy classics. Especially, like I've been saying, the last book is an amazing classic that if you don't read any other books on this list, I highly suggest this one because, like I said, this is the book that turned me into a classics lover. But I'll get to that in a minute. The first book in this section is Emma. A big reason why I wanted to include Emma in this list is because if in case you are a romance lover, I know I don't really have very many romances on this list, but I wanted to include this one. Obviously Jane Austen is like such a big classics writer, but I would say her stuff is a little bit slower, at least to me it is. But I do think Emma is still worth it, especially again if you do enjoy romance. I love Emma as a character. She is so different from everyone else, especially different from everyone else during that time. She doesn't really care about romance or being married, but she also loves matchmaking for other people. And so when she finally starts falling for someone, it's kind of a surprise. There's definitely no like action or anything, but the point of the book isn't for like a bunch of action or like cool visuals or entertainment. It's just to observe this very interesting character walking through life and her stepping into a romance for the first time. Even though this book was a little bit slower for me, I could definitely appreciate it for what it was at the end. So if any of you out there are watching this list and you've been waiting for a romance because maybe that's your favorite genre, this is definitely the book you should try. The second to final book on my list is Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. I know I talk about this book a lot, so I'm going to be brief here, but I couldn't just not include it because it is one of my all-time favorite classics. What's funny is that I'm definitely not a huge fantasy or Greek mythology reader, and yet it didn't even matter with this book because it was just so good. This book is a Greek mythology retelling of the story of Cupid, but in a whole new, very unique way. It's about these two sisters who their father is the king, and the king is very obsessed with his power and keeping it, and he's obsessed with the gods and keeping them appeased so that he can keep his power. And so one thing leads to another, and he thinks that he needs to sacrifice one of his daughters to a god in order to save his kingdom. But the other sister is not too happy about this, and she does everything in her power to save her sister. There's also just like so much more to this story. It's hard to even explain, but what's even cooler is that there's so many biblical metaphors in this book about our relationship with God, how we can't try and hide things like our sins from him, how we need to be vulnerable with him in order to maintain an actual relationship with him. It's just definitely one of my top favorites. I highly recommend. Definitely try this one out. It is finally time to talk about the last and final book that I love so much. It's funny because this book has kind of been like blowing up more recently. I don't know if it's just because there's a movie being made about it or what, if just people have been talking about it more, I don't know, but I'm so glad I discovered it because it's so good. And it is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Again, I know I've also talked about this one quite a bit, so I'm going to make this one very brief as well, but this book is more or less like a retelling of the Cain and Abel story in the Bible, but also kind of the Adam and Eve story as well. This book dives into all the questions of like what makes someone good and what makes someone evil. Are people evil by nature, or do they learn to be that way? Do they have a choice in being that way, or has that always been their destiny? It just really dives into all those questions while retelling this story. It takes place a long time ago, like in the 19-somethings, like the early 1900s somewhere in California. This book has some of the coolest, most interesting characters that I think I've ever read. And I love all the biblical ties, and I love all the deep theological questions being asked. This book is definitely a lot longer than some of my others. I think it's like 600 pages. I like don't even know what else to say about it other than it's just so good and you need to read it. Read this book. Read all of these books. So those are all of my classic recommendations. Let me know if you have any suggestions of ones that you think I should read in the future, and thanks for watching.